I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Joseph Scalia, a psychoanalyst and social critic in private practice in Livingston, Montana. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Available from Trapart Books, 2019. Now also available on iBook and Kindle. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode.
I'm really glad to get to do this. I think the more word gets out there in the world about this, the better chance we have of protecting this landscape. So thank you.
Exactly. It's of the utmost importance. How did you get started in this in the first place?
In the environmental activism?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it's just been a gradual thing, of a gradual matter of accretion. Going back to when I was a little boy, really. But I think the real event was when I first moved to Montana in 1980, and I was, I don't know, in certain ways, a struggling young man. And God, I came into the wilderness and was just saved, delivered. It was a cradle of otherworldliness that I needed.
Transformational.
Yeah, it didn't do away with my then symptomatology, which in some ways I'm still working on.
Aren't we all?
Yeah. But yeah, it was transformational. I remember, so my wife and I came out here together. So we were kids, and we'd had an argument, and I went out and laid out in the back of my pickup truck in 20 below zero with a couple of feet of snow on the ground and crystal clear sky, still air, no wind. And I could see up into this canyon called Lost Creek Canyon from the Deer Lodge Valley. And oh my God, that moment just was something. And then there've just been many since then. Yeah, I've been president of Montana Wilderness Association. I was on its board of directors for 7 years, and am now a critic of that organization. I've been varying degrees of active for a long time, but now I'm in the thick of it.
What is your work now?
Well, so I do have a psychoanalytic practice, but I'm working fewer clinical hours than I used to. So fewer is like in the low 20s now. And that leaves me more time to do other things. And so I'm now president of a group called the Gallatin Yellowstone Wilderness Alliance. And we're trying to protect a certain crucial area of wilderness from other environmental groups, including that group that I used to be president of, Montana Wilderness Association. They and the Wilderness Society and the Greater Yellowstone Coalition have all banded together with industry, I'll say, various industries, including the recreational industry. And maybe I'll call it also, so I'm going to jump to Alain Badiou. Badiou does this lovely differentiation between satisfaction and happiness, or the terms he gives it. And I mean, it's sort of between jouissance and desire, essentially, or between refusal of castration and acceptance of castration. And for non-analytic and non-Lacanian listeners, I'll just interject, that means symbolic castration. That means acceptance of limits, acceptance of lack in being, acceptance of a thing like that there is a thing such as insatiable longing that cannot really be satisfied. We can only chase after it over and over again to our own detriment or the detriment of others. And it also means acceptance of, and this is more difficult, I think, acceptance of what is missing in the social order. So that the social order, I'll use Zizek's way of putting it, his differentiation between there's the public law, there is what society says is and exists and makes sense, and then there is always, as he calls it, the perverse superego supplement, or the obscene supplement or leftover, what isn't said and that is damaging. So Badiou talks about satisfaction as, like refusal of symbolic castration. We're going to go after it. So there's recreation. So now to wilderness. So the battle here. So do we push into wilderness to have fun, to be? So here's how I got started onto all this Lacanian and philosophical stuff. Do we want to be fun hogs, to use a kind of clearly, in my view, detrimental or disparaging term, but a term that some people who are fun hogs use for themselves. So I'm going to go out there, push myself to the limits and just be gung-ho and super strong, and I'm going to ride my mountain bike further and further into the wilderness, and it's just this kind of I will just have fun, and there's a loss of consideration of the greater world. And so that's what Badiou means by satisfaction here in its manifestation in the battle over protecting wilderness. Or are we going to instead put limits on that and seek happiness, which comes out of an embrace of aesthetics, of beauty and the sublime, and not needing to refuse symbolic castration, but rather going through that and finding happiness in that passage and that space. So maybe I'll say a little on the ground what's happening, and then kind of break and check in with you here. So what exists here is, so we're on the so where I'm sitting right now, about 50 miles north of Yellowstone National Park in Livingston, Montana, right near the Yellowstone River and the Paradise Valley. Right outside the window is the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. So Yellowstone National Park is 2.2 million acres. It has roads through it, but it is very wild. And then bordering it to the north is the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness without roads, and it is another 1 million acres. And then so that's like, well, and then there's the Paradise Valley that goes up the Yellowstone River into Yellowstone from Livingston, and then across from that is the Gallatin Mountain Range, which is not protected as wilderness, and it's all of this land is part that I'm naming is part of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, and so the Gallatins are another what could be protected as wilderness is almost another 300,000 acres, but it is also extremely crucial to the continuing existence of the grizzly bear. So Yellowstone, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem is the most intact, richest, large ecosystem left in the lower 48. I've called it lately our America's Serengeti. I mean, it's grizzly bears, it's enormous herds of elk, it's moose, it's wolves, it's wolverines, it's coyotes, it's bighorn sheep, it's mountain goats, it's mule deer, white-tailed deer. I mean, on and on and on through smaller animals, and everything that was here before non-indigenous people got here is still here in this huge landmass. And so the wolves, arguably, and the grizzly bears scientifically solidly demonstrated are dependent on being able to access that land I named a little bit ago, and I'm going to talk some more about it later here, the Gallatin Mountain Range. They need to be able to pass through that landscape, the grizzly especially, into the northern Rockies ecosystem where there are other grizzly bears. So in the Yellowstone ecosystem, there are 700 grizzly bears, roughly, and that's not enough to preserve their genetic integrity going into the future. And so they need to be able to get north, and their access is blocked. So that's the sort of marker of the easiest way to demonstrate, and I'm not an ecologist, and so I can't do the scientific arguments as well as an ecologist could, but I can say it's a good marker of the wildlife health of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, that they need to be able to pass through there. And what's happening is land that has been protected under a different law called that sets aside instead of wilderness. So there's the 1964 Wilderness Act that allows for wilderness areas, quote unquote, in the United States, which means no roads, roughly it means no roads, no mechanized travel, so no mountain bikes, it's not just no motorbikes, it's no mountain bikes. It's you can't bring chainsaws, you can't bring anything mechanized or motorized, but also not mechanized. So it's quite restrictive, and so the impact of humans in there on wildlife is relatively minimal, although there can't be too many humans. And so that needs to be looked at too. And we don't currently have a law to limit that, a federal law, and we probably ought to, as our population is frighteningly expanding, humans across the globe, and here too. So, so finally, in the Gallatins, there's an area called there's an area that is a wilderness study area, quote unquote, and that's protected by a federal law, and is designated wilderness study area, and it can only be changed ultimately by an act of Congress, but there are a lot of steps to getting there, and there are the three big environmental groups who I named already are agreeing to forego the lower elevation lands of that wilderness study area to mountain biking. And so if that happens with the flood of mountain biking that's happening here and the flood of humans that's coming in here, in no time at all, say in 10 years from now, it's just gonna be crazy up these beautiful low elevation for here, relatively low elevation. So I mean, we're talking 6,800, 8,000 foot of elevation, but it's like meadows that then rise up to the mountains above. And it's very rich country and secure landscape for wildlife, including to survive through the winters. But they need it in the summers too. And if you put a mountain biking park in there, which is essentially what would happen, it's going to do severe damage and maybe destroy the passage. So there's in a long nutshell what the stakes are.
That's just the current fight.
Well, very good, Vanessa. That's the current fight. Yeah, there are a lot of them. It's like, what do we do with humanity? What do we do with our kind of collective insistence in this neck of the woods, in our sort of privileged neck of the woods, to be satisfied in Bedou's sense of it, to be fun hogs? Can we collectively put a sufficient limit on that? And right now, even environmental groups who have the money and the political clout to do that have decided not to try to do that.
It's terrifying. I never thought about it the way you framed it too, about, accepting castration. And this is kind of like on a wide scale level. People aren't accepting our own limitation, and we're maybe like overcompensating by just thinking we can just mine everything and just continue to make the earth produce and produce for us and throw it away, be fun hugs, throw it away wherever, it'll be fine, bury it in the ground, not taking care of what we're doing or being conscientious.
Yeah, it is deeply disturbing. And how many people can even allow themselves to reflect upon it is problematic. Yeah.
I originally come from Florida, and it used to be a joke when I was young, but it's really not funny that the highest points of elevation in Florida are all trash mounds.
Wow.
When you're driving down the main highways, I mean, they're like every couple of miles is another one. And it's like, this is just like this all over the state. Like, who thinks that this is the solution, to just keep burying the garbage in the ground? It's.
Yeah. Yep. I know. Yeah, we're just devouring the earth. I have this idea of I'm thinking I'm gonna write a book on like a wilderness ethic that is part and parcel of a collective human ethic, a proposed collective human ethic. So as the Quebecois Lacanian analyst Willie Apollon puts it, we need a collective ethic of the good of the all. And then if you extrapolate or expand that to So that's for human coexistence. But if you extrapolate that to we need an earth to live on, then we need a collective human ethic of the good of the all, meaning humans and all the land. So terra and demos. And so all people, the people, demos, and the land, terra. So to mean all animals, all plant life, all landscape, all land. It's like we've got to have all water, all sky, all air, terra, all of that. We've got to preserve the earth sufficiently. And capitalism has no mechanism to do that. It just continues to devour the earth. And again, citing Badiou says if we're going to keep a place for humanity, there are two problems. One he calls objective, and that's the problem of capitalism, period. To him, it's just that matter of fact, in a world where obviously the capitalistic powers who control the media don't want that to be part of everyday, public discourse. And then the subjective, can we generate the kind of collective human ethic we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it would be really helpful if people would start thinking about the earth as being living. The earth is alive. All of us, everything on it is alive. That would help. Stop treating it like it's not.
Yeah.
And I think the point you said in the beginning as well with this faction that you used to work with and was the president of is now kind of on this other side. But we're seeing that a lot now where like the institutions that we have trusted with kind of regulating these sort of things have kind of been siding with the industries, I think, more than a lot of people realize, instead of keeping them in check the way we had imagined they were, like siding with this like kind of entertainment, recreation industry, part of nature, park life.
Right. Yeah, very good. They have, you really hit the nail on the head. So those three groups, and I'm going to name them again, Montana Wilderness Association, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, and the Wilderness Society, they all have enormous budgets, and they've all increased. Well, I don't know about if the Wilderness Society has increased its budget in the last, say, 10 to 15 years as much as these other two have, perhaps. And I know the other two have enormously, and like fourfold. And they're funded by large groups. They're funded by, foundations with capitalism ties. We get into a critique of philanthropy, right? Those who can give massive, obscene amounts of money got their money through the savage inequalities of capitalism. To be plain and simple and undisguised about it. And so, those three groups, who, by the way, call their way of working with other interests like logging, mining, motorized recreation, mechanized recreation, they call it collaboration and compromise. And like these are good words and these are good ethical things they're doing. But really, they have become part of, and you cited this, you made me think of it, of what Wendy Brown, the political philosopher, calls the economization of everything. In fact, I think that's the subtitle of her book, whose title is Undoing the Demos. And how she talks about how all, and this is what you were talking about, how she, just to expand it a bit, how all disciplines, at least in their dominant voices, have had to capitulate to capitalism, essentially, to specifically neoliberal capitalism, to what's arisen since 1980 that has so obscenely expanded the inequalities of capitalism. And what's happened in universities, how the liberal arts, the humanities are getting more and more attacked, how the sciences and there's the STEM fields are more and more they're more and more reliant on funding from the corporate world. And so what they get to research is more and more determined by the needs of capitalism. So that's what's happened with these big environmental groups. They've wed themselves to the discourse and the negative hallucinations of capitalism. And I mean, I don't think they understand they've done that, but they've done that.
What do you read, or what could we read to read more about these sorts of issues? Like, what would you recommend? Who do you read?
Yeah, well, I've named a bunch of the key people for me already. I mean, I would say, look at, what is the book in which Zizek's paper on where he talks about the perverse superego supplement? I'm not pulling it up. Anyway, Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, Alain Badiou, Wendy Brown, Henry Giraud, who I haven't spoken of, Cornel West. So Henry Giraud and Cornel West talk about activism and, how to go about activism. And, they're both scholars and academicians, but very much activists. Lacan, not for direct activism, obviously, but for the analytic act. I mean, so here's a whole nother area of reflection. So, I mean, I'll offer up here publicly, and of course, as any number of analysts do, we go through more than one analysis in our analytic lives, and I'm back in analysis at this point in Lacanian analysis, and it's really rattled my cage, and quickly and hard-hittingly, and it's like, oh my God. I had a session recently where, I was like tremoring. My body was like I was hypothermic, and I wasn't,
I know. When you get a good cut, it's like getting slapped in the face. It's just like getting completely stunned. Like, what just happened? Like, bam. That's what I felt like.
and so, it's to look at, how do I kid myself? And so I bring it up because it's like, how do I kid myself, and how do I unwittingly disempower myself? And how can I find a space within that is unconveyable, really, to another, in a way that another can say, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about, but that is the space of capacity to influence, capacity to shake up another in an ethical way. And so, and that's Lacan. Others who have used Lacan's work, of course, speak of that, but, as in political activists and cultural critics and philosophers, but but yeah, that's the psychoanalyst Lacan, and I do think there is, for anyone who wants to dig very deeply into this work, there is no substitute for at least reading some fair volume of Lacan, which of course is voluminous, as you know, as voluminous as Freud. So I don't know. Those come to mind anyway.
And I think it's great how you're using kind of psychoanalytic thought to address these social issues, because I really feel like it's been kind of a disservice that psychoanalysts haven't been looking at social theories as much in like past decades. And I feel like we all do need kind of collectively to be like shook up a little and wake up, clearly, you know, like we can't pretend that right now the impeachment trial is not going on. You know, that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. Yeah, I do wonder why more analysts don't enter the public arena, but I'm glad I am doing it, and I am. Well, I mean, you became aware of me because I submitted something to a conference. Essentially, I mean, making those links out of the clinic into the greater world, and I've presented at the LAC conferences also, which is also doing that, and I'm writing. I have a couple of papers in a magazine, an online magazine called Mountain Journal, that is out of Bozeman, Montana. In fact, my wife and I are having dinner with its editor this evening. And I'm looking at, and so I go back to now my own analysis. It's like, so how do I write somewhere like Mountain Journal that is going to get read by all those environmental groups I'm criticizing, or get interviewed here, or get interviewed on Wilderness Podcast, where I was this summer interviewed? And how do I speak and how do I write in a way that doesn't gratify some symptomatic satisfaction, again, as Badiou called it, to grab hold of, to not be derailed by that kind of, unwittingly, derailed by that kind of satisfaction in myself, and instead to speak critically to someone who I'm asking to feel undone by what I'm saying to them. How do I do that in a way that has a chance of them hearing me? And so that's the analytic act.
That's the question.
Yeah. And I know for a long time my way of doing that had a pugilistic form that I didn't altogether recognize. And and that's part of my analysis now, to not gratify that, to do something greater.
What's the psychoanalytic scene like where you are?
It's very small. I've been able to practice psychoanalytically here, though, for decades. I was trained originally in modern psychoanalysis, so like Hyman Spotnitz and Phyllis Meadow, and then got my doctorate at the Boston Graduate School of Psychoanalysis just a few years ago, finished that, in psychoanalysis, society and culture, because I was so interested in cultural criticism and linking that with psychoanalysis. I've been very influenced by the moderns, but also by Christopher Bolus and the middle school. I was in supervision with Bolus, and well, for like 5 years, 6 years, weekly, and one of those years twice a week, because he did a control case for me. And then I worked with him on other cases another time a week. And then for a number of years, I went up to Quebec, to the École Freudienne de Québec, and did their week-long seminars for like 12 years. Yeah. And maintain a relationship with Charles Turk, who's more affiliated with them even than I. He's an analyst in Chicago. And Charles and I we swap off reviewing cases with each other monthly, and have done that for about 10 years. And so I brought all of that mix into Southwest Montana and started a little psychoanalytic institute, and did, quote, certify a handful of analysts through the American Board for Accreditation in Psychoanalysis / the National Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis. And then as I got more and more into Lacanian studies and into my doctorate out of Boston, where, by the way, I traveled scores of times, literally. I think my interest in the Psychoanalytic Institute here waned, and I just didn't have the time and energy for it either, with everything else I was doing. But also, I will say, I think my theoretical kind of hodgepodge that wasn't well enough integrated was part and parcel of why that institute ultimately has not survived. Or maybe I could have tried to make it survive lately, but I haven't been interested, and so let it go. But so there are some practicing analysts here who I trained, and some more Lacanian, some more object relations, one more modern, so they reflect that collection of theories that I brought. But yeah, it's just like a literal handful, like 5 or 6 people, and out of a field of maybe a couple hundred therapists in Bozeman, Livingston. So yeah, we're a tiny minority. And so what's here is what's everywhere in the U.S. It's what insurance companies want.
Yeah, that seems to be worldwide.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, yeah. Unfortunately.
Yes.
But yeah. we thrive, we survive.
Yeah.
Now we have the internet to connect with one another, and we can have a networked international community.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. And that's how I'm doing another analysis at this time in my life. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. I'm finding that's the case more and more, because people don't always have access to the kind of analysis or analysis at all in their areas. And a lot of training schools, especially in the Lacanian orientation, are helping analysts train in that way.
Mm-hmm. Badiou was asked in an interview, is the world situation hopeless? And I think he laughed. And he said something like, well, I'm a philosopher, and to be a philosopher, you really have to be something of an optimist. If you're a pessimist, there really is no reason for you to exist as a philosopher, which is sort of interesting to ponder. But I think you can say something similar about being a psychoanalyst and holding our ground and continuing to maintain in a world that rejects the integrity of analysis to continue to maintain it and practice its integrity. It's lovely, actually.
Yeah, I feel very inspired when I was a younger analyst and learned of all the analysts, that died during World War II and practiced in secret and met in secret to study, and how much they were persecuted, but still continued to feel driven to study and practice the profession. It's incredible.
Yeah, that's great to be reminded of. I'm glad you said that. I knew that and have not thought that in a long time, and had certainly not compared it or likened it to our current situation in the way you just did. Wow, I like that. That gives me even more hope. Huh.
Yeah, they did it, so we can do it.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, and that makes me think of there's like this resurgence in the conservation movement too now. So back in the day, like when the 1964 Wilderness Act passed, there was hope. It was a time of the 60s and the early 70s and an insistence upon human rights and an insistence upon the dreams of equality coming true. And it was a groundswell across the Western world, and then it's gradually been almost suffocated in the last 40 years now of neoliberal capitalism, and of so many, including so many young people, thinking this is it, this is life, being a fun hog is all there is. And yet there are young people who reject that, who say, no, there's more. And so in the conservation movement, that is the case. It's like most young people don't know anything about like the early wilderness fights and that spirit, and don't know that the kind of capitulating to the dominant powers and making friends with the dominant powers, and becoming part and parcel of them. Most young people don't know that there's another way, but it's the job of those environmental activists who knew those earlier days to impart that, just like it's the job of analysts to hold the space you're talking about. And so, yeah, it's an interesting, I don't know what I want to call it, more than similarity, but almost sameness.
Yeah, and it reminds me too of like in the field of psychology and psychoanalysis and mental health, I have a Psya.D, so it's a doctorate in psychology, so it's very clinically based. But that means I learned like everything the insurance companies wanted me to learn, like the DSM and all the psychopharmaceuticals. And in Florida, at that time, they were trying to pass this kind of master's degree that you could get along with your doctorate that would let you prescribe psychopharmaceuticals as a psychologist instead of being a medical doctor. And it was very like oriented towards like that kind of hospital medical model way of thinking. And I just assumed that that was the only way to practice psychology. Like I didn't even know there was any other options at that time. I originally went in thinking Freud, and then when I got there, I was like, oh, is this what Freud's turned into? And it was only later after I finished school that I realized that there were still analysts practicing outside of the DSM diagnostic milieu.
Oh my, how did you discover that?
Well, I was lucky that I had an analyst. My first analysis was when I was in graduate school. And so that was lucky because I originally thought that going into the field of psychology that you had to be in therapy to become a psychologist, because that's what you had to do to be an analyst. So I just assumed it was the same way. And then when I got there, it was not that way. But they did have like a list of therapists in the area that would see students for like a reduced fee. And one of them was in analytic training. So he was a candidate. And so I saw him as one of his cases, I assume. Because it was like $10 a session, So that was fortunate. But I still didn't even really understand that, like, we weren't practicing. Like, I assumed I had like major depression disorder or something. I assumed I had some sort of diagnosis like that, but we never really talked about it. And then when I finished school, I decided I wanted to go to analytic training, and then I realized there was a whole world of it still happening in New York. So.
Wow. And so then you just immersed yourself, it sounds like.
Yeah, I started working in a hospital in an HIV clinic when I moved to New York, and then did analytic training at night, and then started a small private practice while I was still at the hospital, and then eventually, like, gradually just went into full-time practice.
Okay. Here there is, so while I'm formally the only analyst in Livingston, and then there are several in Bozeman. So these two towns are 25 miles apart, Livingston being much smaller. There is a soon-to-be psychoanalyst, so he's finishing his candidacy out of an institute in Seattle, and he is also a psychiatrist. And then there is a psychologist, a Psya.D, by the way, who's done no psychoanalytic training, but has an appreciation of analysis, like a real appreciation, and has referred cases to me where she feels what I was trained to do isn't gonna be adequate for you. You should be an analysis. So that exists here too. Just, I don't know, just little other pieces of hope.
That's great though, for people to understand what their like skill set is and where somebody might fit best.
Yeah. It's interesting. I associate now to, like, so that psychologist, let's see, she came to a couple of seminars that my Psychoanalytic Institute had sponsored. So I knew her that way. But then there were a couple of things. This is interesting. See how this might tie into our overall conversation. I expect it. I'm thinking of ways it does. Here in Livingston, where my wife was then principal of the high school, and now she's co-principal and does other things administratively within the district, like essentially curriculum director. There were two like threads of trauma in one school year. There was a succession of suicides in the school community and local and town. So there were like and a DUI death. So a child died in a DUI death, a gory death, horrible death, and there were 5 suicides, I think, within like a month's time. A couple of high school students, a couple of parents of high school kids, and so there was that. And then in the same school year, there was a Confederate flag kind of, uprising. So the whole nationalism thing that's been going on across the world now, and Trump and Bolsonaro, and well, it's a long list now of national leaders. And so, yeah, there were high school students flying Confederate flags. And so there was just tremendous tension around that between more clearly liberal thinkers and then nationalist right-wingers. And that was feeling pretty traumatic. And so those were at different times, separated by several months, but within the same school year. And so this psychologist and I went in together and did like town hall gatherings. So sort of like large group therapy meetings, essentially. And that's how we really came to know and appreciate each other. And so we spent like some hours. So we did maybe 3 or 4 different meetings like that over the suicides. The first one was enormous, like maybe 150 people in an auditorium where for, I forget how long, a few hours, couple hours, where anybody could speak freely. And it was kind of like Bionian rules of group analysis. And in other words, people had to behave in such a manner where they held themselves each responsible to say what was important to say for the good of themselves and others, and whereby they comported themselves in such a way that constrained everyone else to do that as well. So kind of the ground rules of Bionian group work, and Wilfred Bion. And it was amazing how people behaved and really heard each other. And then we did the same thing with the Confederate flag opposing groups. So I don't know, I just think of oppositions in the world, and sometimes you can bring people together, and sometimes and so there we did with some real success. Bolus talks a lot about that. And he talks about that and that's another one to read, by the way. He talks about that in his book, Meaning and Melancholia. And what is the subtitle of that? The Age of, I'm going to get it wrong. I'm wanting to say disenchantment.
I'll find it.
Okay. Yeah. But then there are times like this with the wilderness movement. I did ask representatives of those 3 environmental groups I listed earlier, a couple of times listed, to meet with their opponents in the environmental movement, and they all 3 refused. And to meet just to, in that sort of Bionian format of a work group that I just gave a brief synopsis of the ground rules for, those 3 groups all refused. That was stunning. And even with me being a former president of one of those groups, they were the worst behaved. At least the other 2 groups got back to me and had the courtesy of, to my face, saying no. The group that I'm a former president of, I contacted 4 members of that group, of their staff, and none of them even got back to me. Shocking. This is the world we're in. So that's when I was like, okay, there's not going to be a work group mentality amongst opposing groups here. So that's when I went the direction. I mentioned Henry Giraud earlier. And Giraud talks about in social movements the need to be, see if I can get the 6 descriptors, loud, disruptive, educative, noisy, systemic, and ongoing. Those are the 6. And so I was like, okay, they don't want to talk, then I'm going to find a way to behave publicly in those 6 ways to bring to the public what those 3 groups have kept out of the public discourse, and including the science that says we can't do this to these lower elevation lands of the Gallatin Range bordering Yellowstone National Park. And I found this group that had already formed, the Gallatin Yellowstone Wilderness Alliance, and started going to meetings with them. And then they asked me if I would run for president. And so they elected me. And so we are being that, those 6 ways of being that Giraud cites. So yeah, there are times to make peace and there are times to resist.
Good trouble. As John Lewis always says, you got to make good trouble sometimes.
That's great. Good trouble. I like it.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Joseph Scalia, psychoanalyst, environmentalist, and social critic. For more, please visit the text accompanying this episode for links to his work. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Available from Trapart Books, 2019. Now also available on iBook and Kindle. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Gained control of what? Images she would capture. Youth is almost always the emphasis. It is important to her what she wanted to remember in her lifetime, 800 of which remain. So and perhaps even history itself, act when it seems as if this is hugely significant for feeling and rewritten in a sense. Indeed this has been helplessness and hopelessness that one may feel dominated the rest by sheer force. Works have been found to have microscopic lens. He first began drawing the abstract art, including. Soon he found a way to fashion a microscopic, common or object while present, and his time, which inundated people and experiencing. The shift in the world has been to accepting. Many produce both a familiarity experience, not unlike the experience of art, as if this history of art, of dissonance, when confronted, similar brand of camera, putting the power of Bindi, citizen, for the first time. Conclusion of a clear pioneer of getting her due, the Swedish artist between life and art. The Viennese defies herself by not having off Clint, was interested in have their art, and may art have its disturbing. As the first shows of the manifest content of their attack on rigid academic worldview, while the latter, particles, plants, and such qualities and abilities, that such skills in work with the boundaries she left upon her death, training over a person's lifetime, while this art markets another frequent the radical possibilities of attended exhibition in art critics, dealers, and parties, if not actively persecuting their own groups and shows, ignored or unappreciated Viennese secessionist group, retrospective entitled during their lifetimes, in the ethically resigned from the association, reportedly aware of, exiled, but of course over time, main concern was with freeing for the guardian, become the new norm, and masterpiece of design, and no one design continues. Snowflake melted, that design was forever, capturing images of accidents, crime scenes, recall, reproduce, and recreate. This might seem was the time of prohibition, gang violence, and shift, life and narrative in a new way, in a way more in rather than what they'd been born into, based on